My name's Lauren Williams, and I'm a heroin addict. Yeah.
So where do you think your opioid addiction began?
For me, it really began when I smoked marijuana in ninth grade, and the minute I got done smoking, I knew that I wanted something more, and I never really knew about details about drugs. I just heard of things here and there, but so I started asking around, and people would give me like muscle relaxers or low milligram opiates like Norcos or Oxycontin, and when I tried that, I like really fell in love, and I actually had knee surgery when I was 13, and the doctor gave me 10 milligram Percocets, which can do some damage if you're 14 years old. And I remember the first time I took it, I took 3 instead of 1, and I got sick in school and got sent to the principal's office. And so from there, throughout my whole high school career, I just wanted more and more of whatever I could get, and no matter what I got, nothing was enough. I always wanted more, but that's where it really began, was with marijuana in ninth grade.
Do you think there's anything that you believe could have prevented that first?
I don't think anything could have prevented smoking, like trying it out, but I think that in 7th, 8th, 9th, the beginning of ninth grade, I should have definitely heard about addiction more, and how it progresses, how you don't have to be a junkie living under the bridge, a homeless man to be an addict. I think my parents could have talked to me more. They never gave me like a drug talk or anything. I think I don't remember ever like watching a video or hearing about drug addiction in school. We always got the sex talk, but not drug talk.
That kind of leads into my next question. What do you think the public school system could be doing to raise awareness to addiction?
I think they should definitely have a whole segment on drug addiction, how it can start, who can be an addict, because drug addiction is not discriminatory. It's anyone can be an addict. You're predisposed. That's my belief, and I think the school system needs to show addiction as a medical disease instead of showing that someone that's an addict is a horrible person or it's a moral deficiency. That scares people away from wanting to talk about their problems. When I was in 9th, 10th grade, if there was like a counselor at school I could have talked to about, hey, I think I might be wanting drugs too much, I think that would have helped a lot. And I got expelled in high school because I snorted a pill in class. I think I never should have got expelled. I think I should have got sent somewhere that deals with young addicts like me.
And then, in your personal opinion, do you think rehab facilities benefit patients?
Definitely, yes. You obviously have to want to be sober, but I don't think I would be sober if I never came to rehab. They not only educate you on addiction and the science and the medical behind it, but they do like group therapies, personal therapy where they kind of look into your past and see what might have happened to you as a child that could have led you to be an addict. They give you support. They show you groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Heroin Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous. They connect you with people that understand you. A lot of the counselors and doctors and people that work in rehab facilities are addicts themselves in recovery, so that really makes it helpful when you are talking to someone trying to help you that knows where you've been and knows how horrible it is and knows how good it is on the other side when you do recover.
Then can you kind of explain how Fairbanks works? If it like how it's benefited you this specific facility?
Well, for me, since I'm a heroin addict, I would have went through horrible withdrawal if I were to quit on my own. So they take a patient and they put them in inpatient, and based on what you're addicted to, they medically wean you off of whatever you're on. And you're usually in for about 5 to 15 days. And then they kind of psychologically assess you in there and see if you need, what kind of care you need. So for me, I got sent to the sober living program. So I lived in an apartment with 2 other addicts, and we have curfews. We have to go to a medical room to take our Suboxone or other medicines. And then we go, in the first 3 weeks, we went to class from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And we learned about, they did the education behind addiction and then those group therapy. And they also do family therapy and try to like reconnect your family and educate your family. So then you graduate from that after 3 weeks and you go to IOP, which is intensive outpatient program. And you go to class 3 days a week, 3 hours a day. And it's basically the same thing, but they get you more ready for the real world. Because at some point, you're not going to have the shelter of living at Fairbanks. And that's what I'm in right now. So then that lasts anywhere from 18 to 24 sessions. So after that, you do recovery management, which is once a week, 1 hour a day, and basically have a recovery coach that's there for you and if you have questions. And you can live in the sober living apartments as long as you want, as long as you're doing recovery management. So that's basically how it works.
Yeah, and then what style of therapy do you find to be most beneficial?
For me, I think the group therapy where other women tell their stories and their daily struggles of coming into the real world again, and just the support from that, and then for also the AA meetings and NA meetings and the whole 12-step recovery group.
If you could go back in time and give advice to your 16-year-old self, what do you think you'd say?
I think I would tell myself that I'm predisposed to addiction, and if I start using these drugs at a young age, I have a long, hellish life ahead of me, and that I would tell myself that some people can drink and smoke and use illicit drugs recreationally, and that's okay, but I can't because it just all goes
So my name is Melanie Short. I'm the manager of adult outpatient services at Fairbanks. But I'm a licensed clinical social worker, so I have a master's in social work, and my concentration has always been mental health and addiction.
So my first question is, why is therapy the leading method of addiction treatment?
Well, therapy does a couple of different really good things. One thing is that, research tells us that, like in addiction, somebody's brain is pretty compromised, right? Pretty damaged. The disease model of addiction tells us that it changes brain function and brain structure, and so you have to rebuild those pathways. And so one of the best ways to rebuild your neural pathways is through meaningful conversation, which is like therapy, or like 12-step meetings. So meaningful conversation that automatically will help you rebuild those pieces, but also the therapeutic approach helps you restructure your thinking, because addiction hijacks your brain and you start thinking in a different way about different things. Your impulse control is decreased, looking for instant gratification. So sometimes we have to question our thoughts and question, like, is this really what I want to do? Therapy helps you work through all kinds of issues. And it can help you work through some of the things that happened before the addiction may have started. So there might have been a trauma, there might have been a grief and loss issue. Some of those pieces start really coming up when somebody gets into recovery, because all of a sudden the feelings are really raw. There's a lot of emotion. And so you got to work through some of that stuff to be able to reprocess it a little bit, and how you are able to work it into your life in a healthy way instead of a dysfunctional way.
Why is talking to other people with addiction a helpful style of therapy?
Oh, wow. I mean, you need support, right? So, like, everybody needs support. Humans like connection with other people. It's one of the things that drives us. So if we feel understood, not judged, the best way to find that is somebody who's in a like situation. Somebody who's similar to me, or maybe has been through some of the same things, or can understand the way I feel about something. I'm probably going to value their opinion more. I'm going to value what they've done in their life. So that's why I like talking to other people with addiction at a 12-step meeting, perhaps. It's so good to have like a good sober support wrapped around you. So people who are doing things that maybe we want you to start doing. If you're a client of mine, I want you to start doing things that other people have been successful with in their recovery. But also just there's something about that human connection. There's a power in a group of people who are, striving for the same goals. And we need to have hope. Without hope in our life, we're not going to go forward with anything. Like, we're not going to try to meet a goal. We're not going to try to do things. And so we can see hope in other people who've been through what we've been through.
What are the benefits of being in a rehab facility as opposed to seeing a therapist while still living independently?
The rehab facility is good because it's a safe place. If you're in a facility, it's a lot harder to go and make an impulsive decision to relapse, perhaps. So that's structured, because your first 30 days, your first 90 days, maybe 6 months even, are your riskiest times of relapse. So if you have structure and support during those times, you're less likely to relapse. So if you're in a rehab facility, that is going to take some of that choice off the table, which is a good thing, because you're just kind of relearning how to think about things, relearning how to manage your emotions. There are so many pieces that, motivation can take us so far, but motivation goes up and down. So one day I might be really motivated in a really positive space, and the next day I might not have such a great day. And if it's easy for me to pick up and use that day, that might be what I do, because I'm feeling uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to have to deal with emotions. It's uncomfortable to have to deal with some of that stuff that is coming up. And so it's easy to make an impulsive decision if you haven't relearned how not to do that yet. So, and plus there is, like I said before, the power in a group. There's a power in a group of people. So if I have a group of people that's really supportive of me, I'm going to feel more driven to not maybe let them down, or to also contribute to that group and help other people in the group. That's going to drive me to do better. But if you're seeing a one-on-one therapist in early recovery, not that that's not a good thing, maybe in conjunction to the rehab, but one-on-one therapist, I might be going for an hour a week or 2 hours a week. And so that's such a small window of time. I need more wraparound support than that, because I've got all those other hours in the day where my mind's wandering and I'm, maybe making some bad decisions, whatever. So the rehab facility it really just helps give you more wraparound support. It's really intensive at first.
There's a lacking number of employed psychiatrists at federal mental health agencies. Do you think the lack of psychiatrists directly affects the opioid issue?
I think that it impacts the opioid issue. I think a lot of the work, though, that is being done with people with addiction is through therapists or peer support. Doctors get involved because there is a medical side of it, but the psychiatrist thing directly, I think it does have an impact, but maybe not as strong of an impact. We don't necessarily need all of our clients to see a psychiatrist regularly, but we do need psychiatrists in the field to be able to provide medication for mental health issues that might be coinciding with the addiction. Because a lot of our clients have depression and anxiety and lots of mental health illnesses that also need treatment if somebody's going to remain fairly stable. So I guess I've walked my way into saying that yes, it does impact it.
Yeah.
But there's so many other pieces to it as well. I think we need more people in this field in general. But yeah, I do hear about in the field the psychiatrists, there's a shortage. And there's a shortage of doctors who know a lot about addiction. That's also another thing that's really a downfall right now is in med school, your general medical school, doctors don't get a lot of information about addiction. It's much more of a broad education. You have to be specific about wanting to be an addictionologist to actually get more information. So like your general practitioner doctors may not know a lot about addiction unless they have taken it upon themselves to study it. It wasn't like a built-in in their courses. So that's kind of unfortunate, given that so much of our population is affected by addiction, and opioid addiction in particular sometimes starts with the with the prescribed pill medications. And so the fact that so few of our medical doctors are prescribing those but don't really know what kind of impact that could have on somebody's addiction or whether somebody already has tendencies to have addiction issues, and then we prescribe controlled substances. So I think that's also an issue. It's like the education of the doctors in the field and the shortage of psychiatrists that get all in their heads.
What are some common misconceptions about opioid addiction and addicts in general?
Well, there's a ton of stigma, right? That opioid addiction or a heroin addict, it's like there's all these stereotypes that somebody is a bad person. That's a misconception. That they're a weak person. That's a misconception. A lot of people have trouble asking for help because they think it's going to make them look weak or bad, or they make bad decisions, things like that. When the reality is, addiction is not a decision. Nobody decides that they want to become an addict, right? Nobody says that. Some people use drugs or experiment with drugs and never become full-blown addicted, and they can leave it. And then other people, based on their genetic makeup or a variety of factors, become addicted, and you can't predict who's going to become addicted and who's not. You can't predict it, so it's a toss-up. So the idea that somebody is a bad person or they make bad decisions or they don't care about anybody else in their life is so not true. Most of the people who come into treatment are very shameful of what they've been doing. They have a ton of guilt and shame. They don't want to talk about it, because they're afraid of how they're going to be judged. And that goes back.
So, hello, my name is Chris Nelson. I'm a physician, an addiction specialist, and I've been practicing addiction medicine now for about 3 years. Prior to that, I practiced anesthesia, was a board-certified MA board-certified anesthesiologist. So, and then did a lot of pain management and interventional pain management during that period of time, and began to see that where I thought we were helping patients with pain management, prescribing opiates, I realized that we were actually probably causing we were more the problem, actually hurting patients as opposed to helping them. It took a little bit of time for us to figure that out, and I think we're still kind of sorting that out. And what I mean to say is, in regards to the way opiates work within the body and specifically within the brain over time. And we used to think they were miracle drugs for chronic pain. We now realize that's not the case. And they are for acute pain, but not so much for chronic pain. So sorry, that's a bit of a
No,
long-winded
it's
introduction.
completely
But
fine. That actually really helps. So when I began doing research for this, the one thing that popped up the most was the mu opioid receptor gene.
Mhm.
Could you maybe explain that to someone who is completely uneducated?
do you mean with regards to either a genetic predisposition
Yeah.
to addiction
Yes.
or the mu receptor itself?
The predisposition.
Okay. We now understand that there are certain genetic traits that typically, or rather, they can be inheritable, and that create certain properties within the receptor in the brain called the mu receptor that you mentioned, that when stimulated by opiates have somewhat of an exaggerated response to the opiate, and so that the response then that occurs ends up creating a greater craving, if you will, for that drug in that individual as opposed to somebody else who doesn't have that genetic predisposition or that genetic trait, rather.
Okay. And how does the mu opioid receptor gene cause vulnerability to addictive disease?
Well, we goes a little bit to what we were just
Yeah.
speaking of in that, but specifically
Mhm.
the response in terms of the exaggerated response. It's important to kind of step back a little bit and understand a little bit of the basic physiology of it, which is also ties into our everyday activities, really. And what I mean by that is a lot of what we do throughout the day is determined, if you will, by a chemical called dopamine in the brain. We hear that a lot along with serotonin and norepinephrine and a few others, but the main players are dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Dopamine is very much involved in the reward system within the brain. So, take for instance, for myself, can I give you an example? I'm a huge coffee drinker. That's my go-to in the morning. So, the first cup of coffee is always the best. Every day, new day starts. I get that first cup of coffee, and I can't do anything until I get that first cup of coffee, and it's always the best one. I then proceed to have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cups of coffee, and then finally, at some point in the day, I'm just done. And it could even be a new pot of coffee. Somebody could have gone and bought a brand new bag of Starbucks coffee and freshly opened, made a whole new pot of coffee, and then I get that brand new cup of coffee, and first sip, and I'm like, ugh, done.
Mhm.
Well, why is that? Why is the first cup of coffee in the day so much better than this one that's made with a brand new bag of coffee, fresh filtered water? It should be better than even the first one that might have been brewed a half an hour earlier in the morning. The reason, in large part, is because of dopamine. And so when the brain is stimulated for the first time in the morning with that drink, there's a dopamine release, and that creates a perception within the brain of how good that coffee is. So it's an illusion, if you will, or an altered perception. And so as each successive cup of coffee, that stimulus hits, the taste buds and sensations, and there isn't as much dopamine release. The stimulus from the coffee has less and less of an effect until finally, even though that's a brand new cup of coffee later on in the day, the brain no longer is responding to it. And so the perception now is that it's not nearly as good as it was in the beginning. And that's dopamine that does that. There's a gradual decline in the dopamine response. And a lot of what we do is driven by that. So eating, the longer the period of time goes without us eating, when we do eat, or when we eat and we get a really high fat content, salt, sugar, a stronger stimulus, that causes dopamine to be released, and that creates the perception of this meal is so great, it's so good. Did you play sports or do you play sports in
Yeah.
high school? Okay, and so I know, like with the guys, one of the things that they'll always kind of relate to is with football, especially now in later in life if they're suffering with addiction. I'll say to them, how many bottles of water do you think you've drank in your lifetime? And, say 1 million. And I'd say, do you remember each one of those? And they'll be like, no, of course not. And I'd be like, but do you remember when you did 2 days in football, where they have to go out in the hot weather, 80, 90 degrees, and they practice all morning, and then they might get a break, but they may go hours and hours without getting water, or at least a couple hours. I think they've gotten a little more lenient these days, but finally the coach blows the whistle, and then they can go get water. And these patients that we have today may be 40 years old, 50 years old, but they can still to this day remember exactly that moment when they got the water, way back when they were teenagers. They can tell me the building that they had to go to. They can remember the water fountain. They can even describe how the water was so cold, but mostly how amazingly good it tasted to them. And that was because the brain was in a severely dopamine deprived state. And once it got that stimulus, there was an enormous dopamine release within the brain. And the reason for that is we have evolved to have that kind of a response. It ultimately is what helps our survival, because that ties into the second property or purpose of dopamine. Number one is to reward behavior, and so that drives behavior. But we don't want to forget it either, or we shouldn't. Otherwise, if we do, then we're not going to know then the next time that that's where we go to get that pleasurable response. So dopamine is very good at moving a memory from short-term into long-term permanent memory, and even with just one stimulus. So that's why, for instance, the football players we're talking about can remember that. I bet you can probably remember at some point in high school in some sport that you might have played, or a moment where you were so thirsty and then you were allowed to, the whistle was blown and you could go finally get that drink. So, and that ties in, if we make the shift with the mu receptor, which is where the dopamine is stimulating, or indirectly rather, with the opiates, when we came across and devised opiates, the opiate, now when it attaches to the mu receptor, if you can imagine, let's say that water response we were talking about with football players, we put that on a scale of 1 to 10, that would, or 1 to 100, that would be a 10, let's say. An opiate comes along, and that's close to 100 in terms of the amount of dopamine that's released. So patients that have first been exposed to opiates will describe it almost as a spiritual experience if they have that genetic predisposition, because they have an exaggerated response. Once the opiate attaches to the mu receptor, they get an exaggerated amount of dopamine released and have a heightened response to that level of dopamine. So they remember it. I'm sorry, that's the last thing.
Yeah.
So they'll always tend to remember that first high, if you will, because again, it shifts the memory of that event into permanent long-term.
Yeah. And then now that opioid addiction is classified as a disease, how has treatment changed?
Well, that's a really important question. I mean, it's a great question, but it's important in the sense that in order for us to have effective treatment for this disease, we have to understand it to be a disease, because otherwise, for too long, we've looked at it as a moral or a character failing and of the individual, when in fact it's just as we just discussed, it's a biologically driven disease. Patients oftentimes before, when it wasn't accepted as a biological disease, wouldn't seek treatment because they didn't want anybody to know. And part of the way the disease works in terms of once, I'm going to kind of go on a roundabout way to answer your question, long-winded answers, but it's a complicated disease. But when the brain has been stimulated so many times artificially with dopamine that the set point of feeling normal, let me describe it a little bit better. You and I are sitting right now, and I'm not in really any pain. My back might hurt a little bit, but it's not, which it does typically a lot more these days than it used to when I was your age. But we're both sitting here fairly comfortable, and that's because there's a balance at this point of dopamine with the receptors in the brain that control pain. When we have the artificial stimulus with an opiate, then the dopamine level gets raised, and that's what gives us that euphoria or that high. But the set point doesn't really adjust much the first couple of times. And so dopamine comes back down, and the set point is here. But then the next time we get high again, that set point goes up a little bit, and dopamine comes back down. Now we're in a little bit of imbalance, and the person will, after a couple of weeks of using opiates, will recognize that, especially after a heavy use on a weekend or partying, it takes a day or two for them to kind of get back into balance. But they may use again, and they may use even more to get up even a more exaggerated response. Now this level gets bumped up again. Dopamine comes back down. Now we're having a bigger and bigger imbalance, so that finally there gets to be a point of continually using the opiates, especially on the weekends, that now all of a sudden in the middle of the week, the set point is so high, dopamine has gone back down to the normal level. This now, whereas this was normal in the beginning, now the set point is set higher. In other words, the brain needs this higher level of dopamine in order to feel normal and not be in pain. The individual has to take an opiate in the middle of the week just to kind of get back to feeling normal. But normal's never enough, because once there's that exaggerated response because of the genetic predisposition, there's an enormous craving to have more. So they take more to get this kind of a response, to get above that normal set point. But every time they raise that set point, that dopamine level higher, the brain wants to reach balance. And so it's going to keep raising that set point to get to where that higher dopamine level is. Well, eventually we get so high up here that the individual has to take opiates almost continuously just to feel normal. And that's what you'll hear people say as the disease advances. The early stages of the disease, there is the pleasurable response. But as it progresses, the individual has to take opiates on a regular basis, a daily basis, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, depending on what we call the half-life, how long the drug lasts in their body, just to function, just to get out of bed, just to get motivated to do anything. So where this ties into your question about the importance of understanding it as a disease and not some moral or character failing, is that when the person is at that stage of addiction, it becomes all-consuming. The avoidance of pain, the avoidance of those withdrawal symptoms. And so they will then engage in behaviors that they otherwise never would have imagined that they would have previously. So they may cut off or they may cut off social ties with people that they love and care about. They may ignore their phone calls. They may not show up for work because they're just so sick from the withdrawal. They drop out of school or do really bad at school. And eventually the disease can reach a point that people that prior to getting involved with opiates will engage in illegal activity, theft, or we've even seen stories in news, individuals that had no prior criminal activity will hold up pharmacies just to get the opiate, because the brain is in a state of life or death in its perception of reality and the pain that they're feeling, not just physical pain, but an enormous psychological pain. That's usually the worst that they'll describe, an overwhelming sense of anxiety. So when they engage in all those behaviors, then aberrant behaviors, we call them, that have negative consequences. They may get arrested. They may people that care and love them are getting more and more angry with them, and so the individual then becomes overwhelmed with shame and guilt. And the people around them that don't understand the disease of addiction begin to judge the individual why are you doing this? Why are you acting like that? Why don't you just stop? Why do you have to behave this way? You're hurting everybody around you. You're screwing up your life. So it was important for us to get beyond that and understand it as a biological disease, so that then we could get patients into treatment and then treat the disease. And then once we can treat the disease, which is with medication, but more importantly also with counseling and therapy, to then begin to deal with the shame and guilt, and also begin to have the individual begin to understand themselves, because it's important that they understand the triggers that would cause them to use for long-term recovery, so that they can recognize those events, 6 months or a year down the road, so that they can avoid those triggers and not run the risk of using those medications again.
That's a good answer. So another thing that came up a lot was the fact that hospitals have a set number of beds designated for mental illness, which would include addiction. Why do hospitals have this policy, and do you see any flaws in that system? And if so, do you think that Congress should make an effort to try and change that policy?
I can't speak specifically for local hospitals. I would say overall, yes, there's been a severe shortfall. I would say that is changing. There have been various bills before Congress, and one is actually passed called the CARA bill. Hasn't received full funding yet, though, but to allow a certain, depending on the state and the severity of the opioid epidemic that they're dealing with, to receive funding to increase those number of beds and length of treatment for hospitals. I think the biggest problem we have right now that we see in our practice here that we would like to see change is we have facilities, the hospital and some outpatient detox centers, but insurance companies will routinely, or even the state plans, Medicaid-based plans, will only allow a certain period of time, and then to detox, to essentially get them off the medication or to wean them off the drug that they're addicted to, but then they discharge them within 4 or 5 days. And that's just not near enough time to really adequately deal with the disease, because then they're discharged, they're really still in a state of withdrawal. And so when they go back out on the street, it's a very short period of time before they use again. And part of that is because of the phenomenon of not only the withdrawal, which really is 7 to 10 days, and most of the hospital beds only allow 5-day period of time on average. There's some fluctuation on that. And I'm more so for a lot of the Medicaid plans. Some insurance companies will pay for inpatient treatment for a more extended period of time, and those are the ones that really show a lot more success. But coming back to the original reason why it needs to change within our hospitals, and our Congress needs to fund these bills that have been passed, such as the CARA law, or CARA bill, CARA legislation, I should say, is that we have to recognize that this isn't just a simple fix of weaning somebody off of opiates in a 5 to 10 day period of time, and then everything's fine. Because there's a secondary phenomenon called PAWS, which is called post-acute withdrawal syndrome. And that can go on for up to 12 months after the individual has been initially weaned off of opiates. And what that is that they'll initially feel much better after 7 days of being weaned off opiates. But then at 1 month or 2 months or 3 months, even like we were saying, up to a year, out of nowhere, they can begin to go into a withdrawal state, a physiological withdrawal state, where they will all of a sudden feel enormous anxiety, sweating, muscle cramps, just all of the symptoms that go along with acute withdrawal, but mostly a very severe emotional, psychological craving, mostly based on anxiety and a sense of dread. and it's the brain is still trying to heal itself, if you will, to get back to a normal balance of dopamine, norepinephrine. But if the individual is being faced with a severe psychological stress, let's say 3 months after having been clean and not used any opiates, such as maybe a fight with a spouse or a family member that has still not accepted the acts or the behaviors that they had engaged in while they were using, and so there's a lot of shame and guilt. So that could be weighing on the individual. They might have lost their job. There could be a financial pressure. You stack enough of these items up on them, and then they're going to relapse. They're going to use again. And to escape that, because that's what the brain is going to go back to. The brain is going. That's the disease part of it. Why we say it's can be a chronic relapsing condition. The brain is going to want to escape that, and it's going to do that with the behavior pattern that it had engaged in previously. So that's where, coming back to your question, we do not have enough funding for this. We do not have enough programs available, quality programs especially, that can carry that person through that whole 12-month period, which is really what's needed, of counseling and monitoring. Statistically speaking, once you've reached that 12-month period of not having used, then the individual has a real shot at long-term recovery.
I'm just gonna check the camera
Okay.
to make sure we're good. We only have 5 minutes left on this thing. It's really weird, but I only
Sorry, I know
one
I'm
more
really
question. No,
long-winded.
it's fine. My last question is that 3 of the largest mental health facilities are also high security prisons.
Mhm.
Do you think a prison is a constructive environment to try and solve someone's addiction?
Ooh, that's a good question and a big question, because the problem is that right now, so many individuals are being incarcerated for drug-related offenses, and we hear it on the news now how our current president, which I think is really good. I'm in favor of this, where he is commuting a lot of the sentences or giving them pardons for drug-related offenses, because that is not where we should be, or rather, we should be treating that while they are in prison, but we are not treating it adequately at all while they're in prison. So an individual may be arrested for a drug-related offense. They go into the jail system. They go through a horrible withdrawal period, and there really is very poor counseling then once they're in the prison system. And in fact, not only is there poor counseling in that system, they are inundated with opportunity and pressure to use drugs while they are in prison from inmates, and drugs that are confiscated into the prison. So oftentimes they will get into the correctional system, go through the initial withdrawal period, but then end up right back on the same drugs while they're in prison, and then eventually get released, and with no counseling, no treatment, and likely on drugs when they were released, and just end up right back in the same thing, using the same drugs when they go back out. Or if they don't use when they're in the prison system, they've gone through the withdrawal, but they haven't gotten adequate counseling, and then they're released back out into the street, again with the enormous pressures that we had talked about previously of dealing with shame and guilt, not adequate work, having to be on probation and come up with the money for all the costs of probation and drug testing. It's a setup for failure. And so then they eventually just go back to using, and then end up back in the prison system again.
Is it just the environment, or is there anything within the prisons that could just try and make this better?
Well, I think one of the things we need to do is a combination of really funding our correctional system, our prisons, with counselors, I don't want to say better counselors, but give them the resources they need. I think medication-assisted treatment with buprenorphine-based medication is critically important, and then that combined with giving them more opportunity when they are released for employment and counseling, a more constructive environment.